Welcome back to the Burnett Breakdown, where I, Hunter Burnett, keep up with the news so that you don't have to. This week, I'm going to be talking about the Ohio Issue 1 election, Maui fires, and a bunch of international news. On Tuesday, voters in Ohio went to the ballots to vote on a ballot measure that would increase the required threshold for ballot initiative amendments from 50 to 60%. So, the ballot initiative would also mandate petitioners, people who wanted to put an amendment up for election, would require them to secure signatures from all 88 counties in the state instead of the current threshold of 44. On the face, this seems like some mundane, kind of boring election process debate. However, the election of Ohio Issue 1 really became centered on the issue of abortion. And that's because by July, Ohioans United for Reproductive Rights, which is a pro-abortion access coalition, secured enough signatures in the state of Ohio to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot in November. That constitutional amendment would have established the right for Ohioans to have an abortion. Now, that amendment, according to surveys and polls done, is likely to pass with over 50% of Ohioans voting to pass the amendment. Again, that'll be in November, so we don't know for sure yet, but that's what many polls are suggesting. And it was in response to that that proposed constitutional amendment for the right to an abortion in Ohio, that this effort of Ohio Issue Number 1 was proposed. It was put up for a vote in order to, many seem to think, and many politicians in Ohio have said, to prevent that abortion amendment from passing later on this year by raising the threshold required. So right now, in order to pass a constitutional amendment that's on a ballot, if 50% plus one vote yes for an amendment, then the Constitution of Ohio is changed. They were looking to raise that threshold to 60%. Now, with that in mind, because this was so central, abortion became so central to this debate, a ton of people showed up to vote in kind of an off-cycle election over an issue that seemingly really wasn't that big of a deal, but you see how central abortion was with just the sheer number of people voting. I think I saw some number of 3 million people in the state of Ohio showed up to vote. And the results were pretty resounding no to this amendment, or to this change in a constitutional amendment procedure. So 57% voted against raising the threshold to 60%, so voted against Issue 1. 43% voted for it. And because abortion was so central to this, many analysts have kind of viewed this election as a precursor for the passing of the abortion amendment in November. That if 57% voted against this issue that was so central on abortion, that it's likely that somewhere around that number will vote for the constitutional amendment that grants Ohio the right to an abortion. And this is kind of another data point in the argument that I have been making, that I've written about before, that abortion is not a popular issue for Republicans. The pro-life position is becoming increasingly less popular amongst Americans in general, and is resulting in Republicans losing elections. Now, I personally don't care about the electoral results of Republicans if it means they change their position on abortion. I would rather them lose elections. Now, that doesn't mean that they should be dumb about their strategy, but what you're going to see in the Republican Party and amongst Republican voters is you're going to start to see abortion become a major dividing issue. I am pro-life. I am pro-life first and foremost. Before I'm a Republican, I am pro-life. I don't believe as a Christian that you can vote for a candidate that is openly supports the killing of the unborn. I don't think that's right, and I don't think that's justifiable. So if, as I suspect will happen, Republicans continue to lose elections based on the abortion issue, then what you're going to start to see are Republicans coming out in favor of abortion, or against, or at least against laws that restrict abortion. And then you're going to have a decision as Christians. We're going to have to have a decision. Are we still willing to make abortion the central issue and pro-life the central position that we hold? Or are we going to start to compromise on that position to remain a Republican voter? So far, for the last few decades, one of the reasons that many white evangelical Christians have said that they can't vote for Democrats is because of the issue of abortion. Well, will that same logic apply to Republicans when you start to have non-pro-life Republicans running for office? I think that's an important question that Christians are going to have to ask themselves. And I think this issue, one in Ohio, is just another data point to prove that abortion isn't a popular issue. Now, with that said, that doesn't mean that candidates who hold pro-life position and even pass pro-life legislation can't be reelected or be elected to begin with. For example, in Ohio itself, the governor of Ohio voted for passed a heartbeat bill legislation that banned abortion once a fetal heartbeat is detected, and won re-election by a landslide. In Georgia, Brian Kemp signed a heartbeat bill and won re-election by a more significant margin than he did last time. So you can be a pro-life Republican candidate and win re-election. But the issue of abortion, especially when voters vote on the issue alone and not on the person that supports those issues, you start to see a lot of swing towards the non-pro-life position. So this is something to watch, something important to keep in mind, especially as Christians. How we vote on the abortion issue matters. Moving on to inflation. So the overall CPI and core inflation number came out this week, and this is a measure, again, a CPI is a measure of a price of goods that people buy. It's a basket of goods that consumers buy, and tracking how much those prices have risen. And then core inflation is a measure that is the same basket of goods, but it excludes food and energy prices because those can be a little more or a lot more volatile. So overall CPI and core inflation rose just 0.2% month over month in July. Annual inflation ticked up slightly in July from 3 to 3.2%. However, a lot of that can be basically contributed to base effects from the previous year, kind of because the rate of inflation began to moderate this time last year. It's bound to be a little bit higher this year, or at least not look as stark this year. In particular, some prices of goods that were tracked that had a meaningful decrease were prices for new and used vehicles. They fell month over month, as did airfare, as did hotel prices. All of those drastically, or not drastically, but they fell month over month, leading to that lower inflation number. And then the largest factor, which is something I've been saying for a while, thanks largely to kind of listening to David Bahnsen, the largest factor driving the headline 3.2% increase this time around was housing, which accounted for 90% of the CPI growth. And the reason why that's important is because housing, just the way that it's calculated, it lags. There's a significant lag in tracking housing inflation and rents. And that, as a result, will likely continue and start to fall in the coming months because of that 6 to 12 month lag in how the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates housing prices. So you're only going to see inflation continue to come down as rent as the price of housing and rent continues to decline as it has been. Economists have actually looked at other measures, other ways of evaluating housing and rent costs, and for a while now have seen them decline. They just haven't shown up in the CPI numbers. Well, now they're going to start beginning to show up, leading to lower inflation. This is important because as the Federal Reserve has continued to climb rates and hike rates, it's now largely assumed that they are done. That they're done with this latest rate hike cycle, because now there is evidence that inflation is taming. However, something else to keep in mind here is that gas prices are beginning to tick up. They are beginning to rise, the price of gas all across the country, and that is largely, and are expected to continue to rise, largely because of an oil production cuts that have been implemented by Saudi Arabia and Russia that have driven crude oil prices to their highest level since January. Also, summer heat waves and the hurricane season in the Atlantic Ocean could and has started to put pressure on U.S. oil refining, which is already operating at near capacity. So one of the issues of the last time the oil prices hiked was that there was drilling going on, but getting that oil refined, so to the refineries and the refineries refining that oil to turn it into the finished product, refining capacity had reached its maximum. So you could drill, but it didn't matter because you couldn't refine the oil fast enough. Well, numbers are showing that is beginning to be an issue again, that we're not refining the oil fast enough, which could lead to higher prices. Moving on to just a devastating tragedy in Hawaii. So there were fires in Hawaii, in Maui, and the death toll from those wildfires rose to 80 people as of late Friday night, and that number is expected to continue to rise. The reason why these fires have been so devastating is they kind of started on Tuesday. I couldn't find how they started. I don't even know if we know how they officially started. But they drastically expanded and drastically grew in size and intensity. And that was largely because of winds from Hurricane Dora in kind of southwest off the coast of Hawaii. That hurricane, the winds from that hurricane have really pushed the wildfire and fueled it, and it's been exacerbated by overly dry vegetation from an ongoing drought. So you have these dry conditions plus these winds that really fuel the fire, and what happened was you essentially had people in Hawaii that couldn't get out fast enough. The fires started and then spread so quickly that they couldn't get out. In fact, there's many, many stories of people jumping in the water, in the ocean, to avoid the fires. And this is officially the worst natural disaster in Hawaiian history since becoming a state in 1959. And so this is just a tragedy. There's not much news to bring from it other than just praying for the people of Hawaii and hoping that everybody can recover, hoping that the city can recover, hoping that the state can recover, and that, especially because tourism is so important, you had tourists in Hawaii that are being affected, that tourism can come back to the state of Hawaii and not fall off precipitously. Moving on to international news. So at the beginning of the week / last week, there was reports that Russian and Chinese ships had gotten incredibly close to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. So there were a combined 11 ships from the two countries' navies that kind of got incredibly close to the Aleutian Islands. They were eventually escorted out of the area by 4 U.S. warships and a recon aircraft. Now, the ships never entered U.S. territorial waters, and the U.S. said that they weren't ever perceived to be a real threat. But it is still a provocative move. And this whole ordeal is kind of reminiscent of the Cold War, where essentially the United States and Russia would do stuff like this, provocative moves that don't necessarily cross a line, but they're still provocative moves, and they would kind of do these moves and wait and see and observe how the other would respond. So Russia and China, it's very likely that they're doing these kind of provocative moves, waiting to see how quick do the United States respond, how forcibly do they respond. Maybe next time, can we go a little bit further? Can we encroach a little bit more? All of these things are just kind of testing and poking, and these are things that I'm sure the United States does back. And so what that means is this incident, while in isolation isn't a big deal, it's part of a pattern of just this increasing tension, these increasing hostilities between the Western world and these more authoritarian regimes. And it's unlikely to be the last incident of this nature. We don't know necessarily what it'll be like in the future, but we can assume that things like this, or these kind of provocative moves, waiting to see how the other responds, this is not going to be the last one that we're going to see. So it's something to keep an eye on, because a lot of times these incidents, remember that there's human beings at play here, that one little provocative move, one little interpretation from a human on the other end, and all of a sudden which was supposed to just kind of be testing the waters, in this case literally, but testing the waters, well, that could spark into something way beyond proportion, way out of proportion, because of the way that it was interpreted. So if a human that is supposed to be surveilling the area sees a provocative move from Russia and China and then raises some kind of alarm and says this is an attack, well, then things could really escalate quickly. And so these kind of little incidences, while they aren't in isolation a big deal, they can all of them contribute to greater tensions and leads to the likelihood that something in the future does kind of spark off into something larger, which is obviously something we want to avoid. In kind of the same vein, President Biden is expected to sign an executive order that will ban U.S. companies, such as private equity companies and private equity funds and venture capitalists, from investing in Chinese tech companies that deal in specific sectors, those sectors being semiconductors, quantum computing, and artificial intelligence. So the executive order bans Americans, companies, or investors from investing in Chinese companies in these specific sectors. And the reason why these sectors were singled out is to prevent China from developing and using these technologies for military purposes. These sectors are seen as increasingly important in the future of military warfare. And so the Biden administration is trying to get out in front of that and prevent China from developing these technologies that could be used in military warfare against the United States. The order cites the International Emergency Economic Powers Act as its legal authority to do this, and the details are still being a little ironed out as it goes up for basically public notice, where they take feedback, and the rules actually won't go into effect until next year. And these kind of measures, first, this is one area where the Biden administration just isn't that different from the Trump administration. The Trump and Biden administration have both handled China basically the same. And this is something that the Trump administration frequently did, was ban, I don't know if they ever banned investment, but putting tariffs, making it, reprimanding companies for doing business in China. And these are all things that I'm torn about. I understand the purpose. I understand that if China, and I believe China is an adversary of the United States, then it is important that we maintain military superiority over them. And if these kinds of technologies really are that significant, then maybe it is worth preventing U.S. companies from investing. At the same time, though, I'm always weary of administrations and of the government claiming that something is an emergency when the actual emergency isn't all that obvious, right? It's not all that obvious that China is catching up with the United States to the point where it is an emergency. It isn't all that obvious to me that U.S. companies investing in these companies could lead to China having military superiority to the United States. That seems like a preventative. It seems like a preventative measure, which to some extent, again, I understand. It is preventative. You don't want to get to the point where it's just simply too late and now there's no going back. China just has military might over the United States. However, I just am very weary when the government bans the market from working simply because of a perceived threat that could happen in the future. That's kind of, it's not necessarily a slippery slope. I just don't like the government trying. I think the government's really bad at making those kind of predictions, and I'd rather the market work. But again, I see the need at the same time. So something like this I've been torn about for a while, but nonetheless, it is simply true that this is just an increase in tensions and hostilities. It's part of the broader economic war that's been going on between the United States and China and the Western world and China. Really, it is certainly going to hurt China's economy and China's development of these technologies at a time when the Chinese economy, numbers came out this week that it's facing deflation. Like, the Chinese economy is not doing well. So this is going to hurt the Chinese economy, assuming that companies can't find workarounds. And that's the other thing, is so many times there's so many workarounds around these rules and regulations that they really don't do all that much except for make it more difficult and make it more expensive for these companies to make money and ultimately the American consumers. So, assuming that they can't find loopholes and workarounds, this will likely continue to harm the Chinese economy, which ironically makes them more of a threat to do something outrageous. When you have a declining power, history shows us that declining powers are more dangerous. They feel the need to take more risks because they don't want to let go of what they could have been, what they were at one point maybe. And so if China sees itself as the rising power in the world, and then all of a sudden it's evident that they're not, well, they may try to reassert themselves as the rising superpower by taking Taiwan or just doing more aggressive actions like that because they feel their power waning. And so this is something, again, to keep an eye on. But it's nothing necessarily that different, that surprising from just the pattern in the relationship between the United States and China that we've been seeing in the last few years. Moving on, something that is a little more surprising, and especially 10 years ago, if you had said that this were the case, then would have been, earth-shattering, really. And that is, according to the Wall Street Journal, they reported that the United States and Saudi Arabia have agreed on a path to normalizing relations between Israel and the country of Saudi Arabia. The deal, which, again, we don't really have, it's not an official deal yet. We just have reporting from the Wall Street Journal. The deal, which the U.S. hopes to finalize in the next 9 to 12 months, reportedly offers concessions to the Palestinians in exchange for Saudi Arabia recognizing Israel, which is huge, right? I mean, the world of the Middle East, again, go back 10, 15, 20 years, and if you had said that these majority Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, that they were going to not only deal peaceably with the nation of Israel, but were making deals with the nation of Israel, that would be staggering. That would have been staggering. It would have been shocking. And here we have just how much the relationships in the Middle East have really improved. I actually lay a lot of that at the feet of the Trump administration. For the many flaws that I think it had, one area that it was very strong in is its policy towards Israel. Their strategy was essentially to go to everyone in the Middle East and say, hey, we all agree, Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc., that Iran is a bigger deal, right? As much as you may not like Israel, Iran is a bigger threat. So let's agree to stop this nonsense and focus on Iran. And that is a strategy that really worked. This deal, reported deal, comes at the back of the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, meeting with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman 2 weeks ago in an effort to move these negotiations along. And I have all sorts of criticisms of Saudi Arabia. I think the human rights abuses that they practice are condemnable. I think they are a despicable country in a lot of ways. I don't think they're a very liberal, westernized, democratic country at all. However, it is good that they recognize Israel, who is, again, with its flaws, a significantly more liberal democratic country, the only, I would argue, in the Middle East. And so that the recognition of Israel by Saudi Arabia is a big deal. It's going to cool tensions in the region, and it's going to strengthen the opposition to Iran. Finally, the continuation of the Niger coup that took place a couple weeks ago. So the last podcast, I did talk about the Niger coup and the fact that this country in northern Africa had experienced a coup, and the former president is being basically held hostage by the military leaders, and this has left the other African countries with the question of how do we respond. It turns out that having a coup next door isn't good for your own security, national security, not to mention if things pop off into a civil war, break out, you could have humanitarian crisis, which leads to refugees crossing your border. So the other countries in West Africa are concerned, and there was an emergency meeting of some of these countries, of the Economic Community of West African States on Thursday. And the West African leaders have basically been debating, what do we do about this coup in Niger? And they ordered at this meeting the immediate, quote, activation and deployment of a, quote, standby force. This standby force, it's kind of unclear what this means. They're not invading, okay? So there have been threats of military intervention in Niger if the coup leaders did not stand down. So this isn't quite there yet, right? They're not quite threatening to invade or to intervene in that regard, but a standby force is something, right? They are in some way flexing their muscles in an attempt to intimidate the coup leaders. So it's not immediately clear what the forces will do, but it is clear that they are not going to sit back and do nothing. At least they're going to threaten intervention. So the reason I bring this up is a military, intervention into the country of Niger could really have spillover effects all across the continent and in the region of West Africa. So the fear now is that the coup leaders are going to harm or kill President Mohamed Bazoum, the former president, because that could really escalate things. You also have in Niger, you're having protests and revolts, not revolts, but protests and some rioting against the perceived Western powers, so France in particular, which was the former colonial occupier of Niger. They're kind of this backlash against the French because Mohamed Bazoum was seen as kind of a puppet to the Western powers in Niger, and now you have these coup leaders that are freeing the people. And so there's a lot of tension in Niger about not just the coup itself, but also the role of the West in Niger. Remember, I mentioned last podcast that Niger has been one of the reliable allies in this region against the rising threat of terrorism in the Sahel region of Africa. And because of that, many people in the country have seen the government of Niger, the Bazoum administration, as kind of a Western puppet. And so this threat, this coup, it's not just the policies of this one individual, but it's this kind of pushback against this wider influence of the Western world in the country. And so with that, there's always the threat of a civil war breaking out, which would be devastating for the people of Niger, would be devastating for the region, and is hopefully something that can be avoided. And with that is the end of the podcast this week. So please like, subscribe, share, do whatever you can to make this podcast go far and wide, and I hope you will return again next week.